My beloved child. Pause here, because the question trembling beneath your silence is closer to an answer than you realize. You have wondered whether the love between you was real, whether the distance erased it, whether their silence meant they stopped caring, and whether the memories you still carry have already been forgotten by the person who helped create them. But in this fictional story of reflection and hope, there is something their heart has been struggling to express, something fear, regret, and pride have kept hidden. They still truly love you. Yet that is only the beginning of what you need to understand, because the reason they have not said it may change the way you see everything that happened. Do not hurry away from these words. There is a detail hidden inside their silence that your wounded heart could never have discovered by looking only at what was visible. You saw the unanswered message. You felt the coldness. You noticed the distance growing wider until it seemed impossible to cross. You heard what they did not say, and your mind turned every quiet moment into evidence that you no longer mattered. But silence does not always mean absence of love. Sometimes silence is the place where love becomes trapped. Sometimes a person feels so much that they become afraid of every word they might speak. They fear saying too little. They fear revealing too much. They fear that one honest sentence will open a door they no longer deserve to walk through. And while you interpreted their distance as indifference, they were facing a truth that became harder to escape each day. They could leave the conversation. They could not leave the feeling. There were nights when you carried your pain quietly, behaving as though you had accepted what happened. You smiled when someone asked if you were okay. You changed the subject when a memory surfaced. You learned how to move through your day without mentioning their name. Yet in the private spaces of your heart, questions remained. Did they ever miss you? Did they understand how deeply their choices wounded you? Did your patience mean anything? Did they recognize what you gave before it was too late? Those questions were never signs of weakness. They were the emotional echoes left behind when a meaningful connection ended without meaningful clarity. Your heart was not asking to become dependent upon another person's love. It was asking for truth. It wanted to understand whether the bond you protected was ever protected by them. And the truth unfolding in this story is not simple. They loved you, but they did not always know how to carry that love with maturity. They felt your importance, but they did not always have the courage to honor it. They wanted closeness, yet something unresolved within them made closeness feel dangerous. When you reached toward them, they sometimes pulled away. When you needed reassurance, they became uncertain. When honesty could have healed the distance, they allowed fear to speak instead. That contradiction exhausted you. You were trying to understand a heart that kept opening and closing without warning. One moment, you felt seen. The next, you felt invisible. One conversation seemed to restore hope, while the silence that followed made you question whether you had imagined the entire connection. You began blaming yourself for emotional confusion you did not create alone. Perhaps you replayed your words, searching for the sentence that ruined everything. Perhaps you wondered whether you loved too deeply, cared too openly, or expected too much. Perhaps you tried to become easier to love by hiding your needs, lowering your expectations, and accepting uncertainty as though it were the price of staying connected. But hear this gently. Real love should never require you to disappear in order to keep it. Your heart was not wrong for wanting consistency. You were not difficult because you needed honesty. You were not asking for too much when you wanted actions to match words. The pain did not come because you were incapable of being loved. It came because two hearts can care for each other deeply and still lack the healing, timing, courage, or wisdom necessary to create safety. Yet there is another part of the story, one you could not see while you were surviving the distance. After you stopped reaching in the same way, something changed inside them. At first, they told themselves your silence was temporary. They assumed you would return to the familiar pattern. They believed you would send another message, ask another question, offer another chance, or find another reason to keep the connection alive. They had become accustomed to your heart building bridges after every storm. They did not fully understand how much emotional weight you had been carrying. Not until you placed it down. Your absence did not arrive like thunder. It entered slowly. Quietly. At first, it was simply a message that did not come. Then it became a conversation that remained unfinished. Then it became the strange emptiness of realizing that the person who once made space for them was no longer standing in the same place. They noticed the difference. They felt it in ordinary moments. A song began playing, and before they could stop themselves, their mind returned to you. A familiar phrase surfaced in someone else's conversation, and they remembered the way you used to say it. They saw something you would have laughed at, and for one instinctive second, their hand moved toward their phone. Then they stopped. Because they no longer knew whether they had the right to enter your peace. That moment began repeating in different forms. A quiet room after midnight. Rain touching the glass. The pale light of a phone illuminating a face that had spent too many hours pretending not to feel. Their finger hovered above your name. They did not press it. Not because the feeling was gone, but because the feeling had become too undeniable. The silence was no longer protecting them from love. It was forcing them to confront it. And what they confronted was painful. They began remembering not only the beautiful moments, but the moments when you needed them and they failed to recognize the depth of your hurt. They remembered the pauses in your voice. The way you said, "It's fine," when it was not fine. The way you tried to remain gentle even when their inconsistency was breaking your trust. They remembered your patience. But more importantly, they began to understand what your patience had cost you. That realization did not come all at once. It arrived through fragments. A memory here. A regret there. A sentence you once spoke that suddenly carried a different meaning. One particular memory returned more often than the others. It was not necessarily the most dramatic moment between you. It may have looked ordinary from the outside. Perhaps you were sitting together in a quiet place, or speaking late at night when the rest of the world seemed asleep. Perhaps you told them something vulnerable about your fears. Perhaps you admitted that losing people had taught you to expect abandonment even when you desperately wanted to trust. You did not ask them to fix your past. You only asked them to be careful with your heart. At the time, they believed they understood. Later, they realized they had heard your words without truly receiving them. That memory became impossible to escape because it revealed something they did not want to admit. You had warned them where the wound was, and they still allowed their fear to touch it. Their regret did not arise merely because you were gone. It arose because they finally understood what you had entrusted to them. You gave them access to the part of you that was still learning how to feel safe. And they treated that access as though it would always remain available. This is where the story becomes deeper than longing. They do not simply miss your presence. They miss the version of themselves they saw reflected through your love. Around you, there were moments when they felt more honest, more hopeful, more capable of becoming the person they secretly wanted to be. Your belief in them reached places that praise from others never touched. But that kind of love can frighten someone who has not learned to believe they deserve it. When you looked at them with faith, they also saw every place where they had not yet healed. Your love was warm, but it was also revealing. It invited them to stop hiding from themselves. It challenged the emotional armor they had worn for years. And part of them wanted that freedom. Another part wanted to run from it. So they created distance, thinking space would make the intensity disappear. They convinced themselves that time would quiet the connection. They tried to focus on other things, other people, other responsibilities. They filled their days with noise so they would not have to listen to the truth inside them. Yet the heart remembers what the mind tries to bury. The more they avoided the feeling, the more clearly it returned. Not as fantasy. Not as obsession. As recognition. They began recognizing that what they felt for you was not simply comfort, attraction, loneliness, or familiarity. It had roots. It had consequences. It had changed them. Your presence had entered the architecture of their inner world, and removing communication did not remove what had been built. Still, there was something preventing them from speaking. You may assume it was pride. Pride played a part, but it was not the deepest reason. The deeper reason was shame. Pride says, I will not reach out. Shame says, I have no right to. They were not only afraid that you would reject them. They were afraid you would listen. They were afraid you would ask the questions they had avoided answering. They were afraid you would calmly describe how their choices made you feel, and they would no longer be able to hide behind confusion. They were afraid that your honesty would confirm what regret had already begun whispering. They had damaged something precious. And loving you did not automatically undo the damage. This is why the title of this message carries both urgency and tenderness. They are desperate for you to know they still love you, but desperation alone is not transformation. Emotion alone cannot rebuild trust. Missing you is not the same as becoming ready to care for you well. Your heart deserves more than a hidden feeling. It deserves truth with responsibility. That is part of what heaven's light symbolizes in this fictional reflection, not a promise that another person will return, but an invitation for you to see love clearly. A love that remains hidden may be sincere, yet sincerity must eventually learn courage. Regret may be real, yet regret must eventually produce growth. Words may sound beautiful, yet words must be supported by consistent choices. You have spent too long questioning your worth because someone else struggled to express their heart in a healthy way. Their silence was never an accurate measure of your value. Their confusion was not proof that you were forgettable. Their fear did not make your love foolish. Even when the connection could not continue as it was, what you offered still mattered. The kindness was real. The prayers were real. The nights you stayed awake trying to understand were real. The sacrifices were real. But something else was real too. You were becoming tired. There came a point when hope no longer felt like light. It felt like waiting in a hallway with no door opening. You were emotionally suspended between what they once showed you and what they currently refused to explain. You did not know whether to hold on or walk away, whether to speak or remain silent, whether to trust the bond or protect yourself from it. You wanted clarity. Instead, you received fragments. And fragments can keep a wounded heart attached longer than a clear ending ever could. A kind message after days of distance. A sudden moment of tenderness. A look that seemed to say everything. Then another disappearance. Another wall. Another reason. Each fragment revived hope without giving it somewhere safe to live. Eventually, something within you understood that love should not continuously require you to decode it. That understanding became the beginning of your transformation. You did not stop caring overnight. You simply started caring about yourself too. You began realizing that your peace was not betrayal. Your boundaries were not cruelty. Your silence was not punishment. It was the language of a heart that had run out of ways to explain the same wound. And when you stopped over-explaining, they began hearing what your words had never been able to make them understand. Your absence became a mirror. In that mirror, they saw the opportunities they had wasted. They saw conversations they could have handled differently. They saw how often you had offered softness when they gave uncertainty. They saw that you were not demanding perfection. You were asking for presence. One evening, the realization became stronger than usual. In this fictional scene, the room was dim, the kind of quiet that makes every thought sound louder. A small light glowed near the window. Outside, rain moved across the glass in uneven lines, as though the night itself were trying to remember something. They had been carrying on with their routine, doing what people do when they want to convince themselves they are fine. They had answered messages, completed tasks, smiled where expected, spoken about ordinary things. But when the noise settled, your memory entered without permission. They opened an old conversation. Not to send anything. Only to look. At first, they scrolled quickly, almost carelessly. Then something made them slow down. It was a message from you, one they had read before but never fully understood. You had written with tenderness, even though you were hurting. You had tried to explain that you did not need grand gestures. You needed truth. You needed to know that the connection mattered enough for both people to protect it. The words had seemed emotional when they first received them. Now they seemed prophetic. They could suddenly see what was coming through the spaces between your sentences. You were not trying to control them. You were trying to warn them that your heart could not remain forever in uncertainty. They continued reading. They found moments where you made them laugh. Moments where you encouraged them. Moments where you offered grace after being disappointed. Moments where you believed their explanations because you wanted love to become stronger than fear. Then they reached the final part of the conversation. The tone had changed. Your words were still gentle, but the exhaustion beneath them was unmistakable. You were not begging. You were not angry. You were simply beginning to understand that you could not keep proving your sincerity to someone who was still hiding from their own. They read the last sentence more than once. And something in them broke open. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Their shoulders lowered. Their breathing changed. The hand holding the phone trembled slightly. For the first time, they stopped thinking about how your distance affected them and began thinking about what their behavior had done to you. That was the turning point. Before that night, their longing had mostly centered on losing access to your warmth. After that night, their regret centered on the pain you had carried. This difference matters. Many people miss what someone gave them. Fewer people become willing to understand what that person endured. Their heart was moving from selfish longing toward accountability. But the movement was incomplete. Because accountability requires more than feeling guilty in a quiet room. It requires facing the person you hurt without controlling how they respond. It requires apologizing without demanding immediate forgiveness. It requires accepting that love may still exist even when trust needs time, distance, or a completely different form. They understood this, and that understanding created a new fear. What if they spoke too late? What if your healing had already carried you beyond the place where their confession could reach you? What if you still loved them, but had learned not to return to what once diminished your peace? These questions followed them into the days that came after. They began composing messages they never sent. Some were too long. Some were too vague. Some said, "I miss you," when what they needed to say was, "I understand how I hurt you." Some apologized but still contained explanations designed to protect their image. Each time they reread the words, they recognized that they were still trying to escape the full truth. So they deleted them. Again and again. The message they wanted to send was simple. The truth behind it was not. They wanted you to know that they still loved you. But they also knew those words might reopen a wound. They feared sounding selfish. They feared appearing only because loneliness had become uncomfortable. They feared that you would think the confession was another fragment, another spark of hope followed by another retreat. And perhaps that fear was justified. Because you had seen intensity before. What you had not seen was consistency. This is where your inner journey and their hidden struggle began, moving in opposite directions. While they were finally confronting the meaning of your absence, you were learning how to exist without waiting for their next emotional shift. You began reclaiming pieces of yourself. You returned to parts of life you had neglected while trying to understand them. You noticed how much energy uncertainty had taken from you. You began sleeping a little more peacefully. Breathing a little more freely. Smiling without immediately wishing they could see it. Healing did not mean you forgot. It meant the memory no longer controlled every hour. You still had difficult days. A song could reopen the ache. A familiar place could bring tears without warning. There were moments when you missed them so much that progress felt imaginary. But beneath the pain, something stronger was growing. Dignity. You stopped confusing longing with instruction. You understood that missing someone does not always mean you should return to the same situation. Loving someone does not require abandoning wisdom. Forgiveness does not mean removing every boundary. Hope does not require putting your life on hold. This growth was visible in ways you may not have recognized. Your silence became calmer. Your prayers became less about changing another person and more about receiving clarity. You stopped asking, "How can I make them choose me?" You began asking, what kind of love allows both people to feel safe, honest, and respected? That question changed the spiritual meaning of the entire connection. Because perhaps the purpose of this season was never simply to bring two people together. Perhaps it was to reveal what each heart needed to heal before love could become healthy, whether together or apart. You needed to learn that your worth does not decrease when someone fails to recognize it in time. They needed to learn that love cannot survive forever on unspoken intentions. You needed to stop carrying the whole relationship. They needed to feel the weight of the part they had refused to carry. You needed to understand that boundaries are not the enemy of love. They needed to understand that access to your heart was a privilege, not an entitlement. And then came another unexpected moment. They heard your name. It happened casually, in a conversation that had nothing to do with the two of you. Someone mentioned you, perhaps without realizing the effect it would have. The room did not change, yet for them, everything became still. They tried to remain composed. They listened for details. Were you doing well? Were you happy? Had you moved on? They wanted to ask, but asking would reveal too much. So they remained quiet while every part of them leaned toward the conversation. Then one small detail reached them. You had changed. Not in a bitter way. Not in the way fear had imagined. You had become more grounded. More protective of your peace. More certain of what you would and would not accept. That information struck them more deeply than hearing you were still hurting would have. Your healing frightened them because it meant you were no longer standing where they left you. They had imagined time waiting obediently for their courage. But time had been working on you too. The truth became unavoidable. They could not return with the same excuses and expect the same access. They could not offer half-truths to the version of you who had learned to recognize them. They could not simply say, "I still love you," and assume those words would be enough. Love had to become braver. And in the quiet days that followed, they began asking themselves the question they had avoided from the beginning: if I truly love this person, am I willing to honor their healing even if it does not give me the outcome I want? That question separated possession from love. Possession says, come back so I can feel better. Love says, I want to become honest, even if honesty cannot erase the past. Possession resents your boundaries. Love understands why they became necessary. Possession wants immediate reassurance. Love accepts that trust may need to be rebuilt slowly or may never return in the same form. They were beginning to see the difference. Yet the deepest revelation had still not surfaced. There was a reason their fear had been so powerful. A reason closeness caused them to retreat. A reason your sincerity awakened both love and panic inside them. Long before you entered their life, they had learned to associate emotional vulnerability with loss. Perhaps someone they trusted had disappeared. Perhaps affection had been inconsistent. Perhaps they had grown accustomed to love being offered and withdrawn unpredictably. Perhaps they had survived by becoming difficult to reach, believing that distance would protect them from rejection. Then you arrived. You did not create the wound. You revealed it. Your love touched the place where they had built defenses. And because they had mistaken those defenses for strength, they did not understand why being loved by you felt both comforting and terrifying. When you drew near, they wanted to surrender. When surrender began feeling real, they pulled away. Their pattern was not proof that your love lacked power. It was evidence that your love reached a place they had spent years avoiding. But understanding a wound does not excuse the harm it causes. This message is not asking you to romanticize their avoidance. It is not asking you to wait endlessly for potential. Compassion and discernment can live together. You can recognize why someone struggled while still protecting yourself from the consequences of their unhealed behavior. That is emotional wisdom. And wisdom is becoming central to what happens next. Because their heart is approaching a decision. Not a guaranteed reunion. Not a promised message. A decision about truth. For days, they carried a private conflict. One part of them wanted to remain silent and let you continue healing without interruption. Another part believed silence had already caused too much damage. They feared that withholding the truth would allow you to carry an unnecessary belief that you had been forgotten, that your love had meant nothing, or that they had walked away untouched. They could not bear the thought that you might spend years believing a lie their fear created. You mattered. You still mattered. They loved you. They had loved you even while behaving in ways that made love difficult to recognize. But would saying this help you, or would it only relieve them? That was the question they could not answer. They began praying in their own imperfect way. Not with polished language. Not with certainty. It was a whisper in the darkness, spoken by someone who had finally run out of places to hide. Help me tell the truth without hurting them again. The room remained quiet. Yet within that quiet, something shifted. For the first time, they were not praying for you to return. They were praying for the courage to act with integrity. This was new. Their previous longing had been centered on outcome. Now their prayer was centered on character. They began to understand that loving you required becoming someone who could face discomfort without disappearing. Someone who could listen without defending. Someone who could respect your answer, even if your answer wounded them. And with that understanding came a memory they had buried. A memory involving a promise. Perhaps they made it directly. Perhaps it was implied in a moment of deep connection. Maybe they told you they would never intentionally make you feel alone. Maybe they said they would speak honestly if fear ever became too strong. Maybe they promised they would not repeat the same kind of abandonment you had experienced before. At the time, they meant it. But meaning a promise and becoming capable of keeping it are not the same thing. They remembered your face when you believed them. They remembered how carefully you allowed hope to enter. They remembered the trust in your voice. Then they remembered the moment their actions contradicted everything they had said. That memory did more than create guilt. It created clarity. They realized that the message they needed to send could not begin with, "I miss you." It could not begin with, "I hope you're okay." It could not begin with a casual phrase designed to test whether the door was still open. It had to begin with the truth they had been avoiding. They needed to acknowledge the promise. They needed to admit they had broken it. And they needed to tell you why, not as an excuse, but as a confession. That was the hidden truth gathering strength beneath their silence. But before they could speak it, they encountered one more obstacle. They saw something that made them believe you might have finally let go. Perhaps it was a photograph where your smile looked peaceful. Perhaps it was a sentence you shared about choosing yourself. Perhaps someone told them you seemed happier. Whatever the detail, it reached them at the exact moment they were preparing to stop hiding. Their courage collapsed. They stared at the evidence of your healing and wondered whether contacting you would be an act of love or selfishness. For several hours, they decided to remain silent forever. They told themselves you deserved peace more than you deserved their explanation. They convinced themselves that love, in this case, meant staying away. But beneath that decision was still fear. Not only concern for your peace. Fear of hearing that you no longer needed them. Fear of discovering that your life had grown lighter without their uncertainty. Fear of being forgiven but not welcomed back. Fear of learning that love can remain in the heart while a relationship remains in the past. These possibilities forced them to confront the final illusion they had been holding. They had assumed confession would create control. They imagined that once they told you the truth, the story would move according to their hope. But truth does not control. Truth releases. When spoken sincerely, it gives the other person freedom to respond from their own healing. That freedom terrified them. Yet without it, any confession would still be about possession rather than love. So they waited one more night. In this fictional moment, dawn had not yet arrived. The world outside was wrapped in blue-gray stillness. A faint line of light rested at the horizon, not bright enough to transform the sky, but strong enough to promise that darkness was not permanent. They sat alone with their phone in their hand. Your conversation was open again. This time, they did not scroll through the past. They opened a blank message. They typed your name. Deleted it. Typed a greeting. Deleted that too. Every ordinary beginning felt dishonest because nothing about what they needed to say was ordinary. Their heart was beating faster now, not because they expected a miracle, but because honesty was asking them to step beyond every defense they had used before. They closed their eyes. And in that stillness, your final conversation returned with perfect clarity. They remembered the way you had tried to remain strong. They remembered the sadness beneath your calm words. They remembered how you gave them one final opportunity to speak honestly. They had not taken it. Now the silence between you contained everything they had failed to say. Their fingers moved again. This time, they did not begin with longing. They began with responsibility. I have been afraid to tell you the truth because I know that saying I love you does not erase what I did. They stopped. Read it. For the first time, the sentence did not feel like an attempt to pull you back. It felt like an opening through which honesty could finally enter. They continued. They wrote that your distance had forced them to see what your closeness had tried to teach them. They admitted that they had mistaken your patience for permanence. They acknowledged that they had expected you to remain available while they remained uncertain. They wrote that you had not asked them to be perfect. You had asked them to be real. They confessed that they had loved you while still running from the vulnerability that love required. They admitted that their silence had been shaped by fear, but that fear did not justify leaving you to carry confusion alone. Line by line, the message became less about getting you back and more about giving you the truth. They told you that they remembered the promise. They told you they understood why your heart had finally stepped away. They told you they did not blame you for choosing peace. Then their hands became still. Because they had reached the part they had never spoken to anyone. The real reason they had pushed you away when the bond became deepest. It was not another person. It was not a lack of feeling. It was not because you had failed them. It was a truth about themselves they had been ashamed to face, a truth connected to the exact moment they realized they loved you, and the decision they made immediately afterward. That decision had shaped every silence, every mixed signal, every retreat. And now, if they revealed it, you would finally understand why their love had looked so much like leaving. They looked toward the window. The first light of morning was beginning to enter the room. Their thumb hovered above the screen as they typed the confession they had hidden since the night everything changed between you. But just before they could complete the sentence, they opened the final message you had once sent them and discovered that one line at the bottom contained a truth about your love they had never noticed before.